Imagine this. You are at the heart of the Vatican, not in a grand basilica filled with solemn prayers, but in a private, sumptuously decorated apartment, hidden away from the world's pious gaze. The year is 1501, the month November, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, exotic spices, and something far more potent, the heady musk of illicit desire. Flickering torchlight dances across gilded frescoes, illuminating scenes of saints and martyrs on the walls, now starkly at odds with the depravity unfolding beneath them. You stand among a select, scandalous few, invited to a feast hosted by the most powerful man in Christendom, a man whose very title should command reverence and purity. The table before you groans under the weight of silver platters piled high with delicacies, pheasant stuffed with truffles, glistening fresh fruits, and flagons of potent, ruby-red wine. But your eyes, and indeed the eyes of every guest present, are drawn not to the food, but to the center of the room. There, on a vast, intricately woven carpet, lie 50 naked courtesans, their bodies artfully arranged like offerings. They are beautiful, young, plucked from the most notorious brothels of Rome, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and practiced allure. Music, a raucous and earthy tune played on lutes and pipes, fills the space, barely masking the nervous titters of the guests. Then, he enters. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. His face, usually a mask of shrewd political calculation, now gleams with an almost boyish delight. He is an old man, by then in his early 70s, but his eyes still hold a sharp predatory glint. He settles into his ornate chair at the head of the table, flanked by his notorious children. Cesare, the warrior cardinal turned duke, his face a study in dark amusement, and Lucrezia, his famously beautiful daughter, whose gaze seems to flicker between fascination and a strange, almost weary resignation. The air crackles with an electric tension, a palpable sense of anticipation for what is to come. A signal is given. Servants, their faces carefully blank, begin to scatter chestnuts across the carpet, showering them onto the bodies of the waiting women. The music swells. The Pope gestures, a broad sweeping motion of his hand, and the guests, a mix of cardinals, nobles, and powerful figures of Rome, descend. It is not a polite scramble for food. Oh no, this is a contest. A game orchestrated for the Pope's twisted amusement. Men, some of them elderly, some barely more than boys, begin to crawl on their hands and knees among the writhing forms, retrieving the chestnuts, not with their hands, but with their mouths. The prize for gathering the most? Not gold, not jewels, but the favor of one of the courtesans, to be enjoyed there, in full view of the assembled company, under the approving gaze of the Vicar of Christ himself. The apartment descends into a chaos of gasps and moans, of bare flesh and frantic movements. The line between sacred and profane is not just blurred, it is obliterated, shattered into 1,000 scandalous fragments. This is the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, held within the hallowed walls of the Apostolic Palace, an event so brazenly sacrilegious, so utterly devoid of spiritual decorum, that it would forever sear the name Borgia into the annals of history as a byword for corruption, lust, and unholy power. How could a man, supposedly chosen by God to lead his church, a man who held the very keys to heaven and hell in his hands, descend to orchestrate such a blasphemous spectacle? What twisted path led Rodrigo Borgia, a man of immense intellect and charm, to become Pope Alexander VI, a figure whose reign would redefine the very meaning of papal depravity? To understand this, we must journey back, far from the decadent glow of the Vatican's private chambers, to a sun-drenched land across the sea, to the very beginning of the man before he became the monster. Rodrigo Borgia, born Roderick de Borja y Borja in Játiva, Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon, in 1431, was not destined by birth for the heights he would reach. His family, though respectable, was not of the ancient Roman nobility that typically dominated the papal court. They were Spanish, a detail that would always mark them as outsiders in the fiercely nationalistic Italian peninsula. His early life was not one of destitution, but it was certainly not one of privilege that would guarantee him a place among Europe's elite. He was a bright, energetic boy, possessing a quick wit and a natural charisma that drew people to him. He was handsome, even then, with dark, piercing eyes and a commanding presence that hinted at a formidable will. The church, in that tumultuous era of the Renaissance, was not solely a spiritual institution. It was a vast, sprawling empire of wealth, land, and political influence, a ladder for ambitious men to climb. For a bright, non-noble boy from a distant province, it offered an unparalleled path to power, prestige, and security. Rodrigo's destiny began to shift dramatically when his maternal uncle, Alonso de Borja, a learned and politically astute cardinal, was elected Pope Calixtus III in 1455. This event was a seismic shock, not just for the family, but for young Rodrigo himself. Suddenly, the doors of opportunity, previously glimpsed only from afar, swung wide open. Under his uncle's patronage, Rodrigo's ascent was meteoric. He was appointed a cardinal deacon at the tender age of 25, a position of immense power and wealth that would typically take decades to achieve. He became the vice-chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, a role that put him in charge of the vast administrative machinery of the Vatican, controlling its finances, its legal apparatus, and its diplomatic corps. He proved himself an exceptionally capable administrator, shrewd, efficient, and possessing an almost boundless capacity for work. He managed the papal household, navigated the treacherous political currents of Rome, and amassed a considerable personal fortune through various benefices and appointments. Those who knew him in these early years spoke of a man of immense personal charm, a captivating conversationalist, and a generous host. He was known for his love of beautiful things, his patronage of the arts, and his appreciation for the finer aspects of life. He built magnificent palaces, collected rare manuscripts, and cultivated an image of a sophisticated Renaissance prince. He was not a recluse or a monk. He reveled in the world, in its pleasures and its power. His clerical vows, particularly those of celibacy, seemed to sit lightly upon his conscience, as they did for many high-ranking churchmen of the era. Mistresses were common, and children, though technically illegitimate, were often openly acknowledged and provided for. Rodrigo was no exception. He had several long-term mistresses and fathered numerous children, most famously Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Jofre, with his beloved Vanozza de Catanei, a Roman noblewoman who remained his confidant for decades. In those days, the moral landscape of the church was a tangled wilderness, far removed from the strictures of later centuries. Rome, under the various popes, was often a hotbed of intrigue, corruption, and open indulgence. Cardinals lived like princes, maintaining lavish courts, fighting private wars, and engaging in all manner of worldly pursuits. Rodrigo Borgia, in his youth, was a product of this environment, an ambitious man simply playing by the rules of the game as they were understood. He was intelligent, handsome, and charismatic, a truly gifted politician. He could have been a respected statesman, a brilliant diplomat, or a successful merchant prince. But fate, and his own insatiable drive, pushed him towards the ultimate prize, the chair of St. Peter. The question, then, is not merely how he could orchestrate such an event as the Banquet of Chestnuts, but how the man described as an able administrator and charming cardinal transformed into the Alexander VI of legend, a figure synonymous with unchecked ambition and moral decay. The answer lies deep within his psychological makeup, a profound and unshakable conviction that rules, particularly moral ones, were for lesser men. For Rodrigo Borgia, the church was less a divine institution and more a magnificent ancient engine of power, wealth, and influence, a vehicle perfectly suited for the realization of his grandest dreams. His ambition was not merely personal. It was dynastic. an overwhelming desire to elevate the Borgia name, to carve out a permanent place for his family among the great ruling houses of Italy and Europe. He looked at the fragmented Italian peninsula, perpetually at war, and saw not just a collection of city-states, but a landscape ripe for conquest, a canvas upon which he could paint the glorious future of his bloodline. The papacy, for him, was the ultimate tool, a spiritual crown that conferred temporal authority, allowing him to act as both a religious leader and a secular monarch. He saw himself as a kingmaker, a nation builder, and his children were not just offspring, but crucial pieces in a vast, intricate game of power and legacy. This dynastic obsession was the core psychological wound, the driving force behind almost every decision he made as pope. He lived in an age where family loyalty was paramount, where the advancement of one's kin was seen as a moral imperative, particularly for those in positions of power. But for Rodrigo, this imperative was amplified to an almost pathological degree. His children, especially Cesare and Lucrezia, were not simply loved. They were instruments, extensions of his will, to be deployed in strategic marriages, military campaigns, and political alliances. Their happiness, their personal desires, were secondary, if they were considered at all, to the greater glory of the Borgia name. He also possessed a profound moral relativism, a worldview shaped by the deeply corrupted environment of the Renaissance Church. He did not invent simony, the buying and selling of church offices. He merely perfected it. He did not introduce nepotism. He simply exploited it with a vigor unmatched by his predecessors. The idea that his actions, however scandalous, might be inherently sinful, seemed to genuinely perplex him. He believed that his position as Pope, as the Vicar of Christ, somehow elevated him above common morality, that his decisions, however self-serving, were implicitly justified by the divine office he held. He was, in his own mind, a pragmatist, an effective leader doing what was necessary to secure the power of the Church, which, in his lexicon, was indistinguishable from the power of the Borgia family. And then there was the sheer intoxicating effect of absolute power. When he finally ascended to the papal throne, he became one of the most powerful men in Europe, with armies at his command, vast wealth at his disposal, and the spiritual authority to excommunicate kings. This level of authority, unchecked by any meaningful external force or internal moral compass, proved to be a corrosive agent. It allowed him to indulge every whim, to silence every critic, and to believe himself utterly beyond reproach. The fear of mortality, perhaps, also played a part. As he aged, the desire to leave an indelible mark, to ensure the permanence of his dynasty beyond his own fleeting life, intensified. He wanted the Borgia name to echo through history, not just as a footnote, but as a dominant force, a royal line. The political landscape of Italy at the close of the 15th century was a chaotic tapestry of shifting alliances, betrayals, and constant warfare. The Papal States, ostensibly ruled by the Pope, were in reality a collection of fractious territories, constantly threatened by powerful neighbors like Naples, Florence, Milan, and Venice, as well as by ambitious local lords. To maintain control, the Pope needed military might, political cunning, and a steady stream of funds. Rodrigo Borgia, the cardinal, understood this intimately. He saw the papacy as a secular kingdom to be defended and expanded, and he approached its governance with the mindset of a ruthless monarch, not a spiritual shepherd. This was the lens through which he viewed the world, and it would dictate every move he made as Pope Alexander VI. The year 1492 was a watershed for Europe, a year of grand discoveries and profound changes. For Rodrigo Borgia, it was the year of his ultimate triumph. Pope Innocent VIII had died, and the College of Cardinals convened to elect his successor. The conclave was a cesspool of intrigue, bribery, and backroom deals, even by the standards of the time. Rodrigo, by then the wealthiest and most experienced cardinal, had been preparing for this moment for decades. He owned vast estates, controlled numerous benefices, and had cultivated a network of loyalties through decades of shrewd administration. He understood that power, in Rome, was bought. He deployed his immense wealth with surgical precision. To Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, he promised the vice-chancellorship, immense revenues, and 4 mules laden with silver. To Cardinal Orsini, he pledged 2 cities. Other cardinals received promises of lucrative bishoprics, abbacies, and immense sums of money. The voting was not about piety or theological rectitude. It was a blatant auction, a contest of material promises. And Rodrigo Borgia, with his boundless resources and unshakable will, outbid them all. On August 11, 1492, the bells of St. Peter's rang out, announcing the election of a new pope. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, emerged onto the balcony, his face radiating triumph. The announcement sent shockwaves across Europe. While some celebrated his election as a testament to his undeniable administrative abilities and political acumen, many others, particularly those who understood the extent of the simony involved, viewed it with profound cynicism and dread. The Venetian ambassador, a keen observer of papal politics, famously remarked, "He is a man of great intelligence and skill, but of little conscience." The stage was set for a pontificate unlike any other, one that would plunge the papacy into an abyss of scandal and redefine the very concept of spiritual authority. But that wasn't even the worst part. From the moment he donned the papal tiara, Alexander VI's pontificate was an open declaration of his dynastic ambitions. He did not even attempt to hide his children from public view, as some of his predecessors had. Instead, he openly acknowledged them, showered them with titles, lands, and wealth, and immediately began to weave them into the fabric of his political designs. His beloved Vannozza de Catane, his longtime mistress and the mother of his 4 most prominent children, was granted lavish properties and treated with immense respect, almost as a queen behind the scenes. Rome, already accustomed to papal mistresses, watched in a mixture of awe and horror as Alexander made his family's advancement the central policy of his reign. His eldest son, Juan, was quickly made Duke of Gandia, a title of Spanish nobility. Alexander's initial plan was for Juan to be the military arm of the Borgia family, the warrior prince who would carve out a secular state from the papal territories. But Juan was a feckless, dissolute young man, more interested in debauchery and gambling than in military command. He was arrogant, prone to violence, and deeply unpopular. This was a source of constant frustration for Alexander, who saw in Juan his own desires for military conquest and dynastic glory, but lacked the raw ability to achieve them. Then there was Cesare. Oh, Cesare! The very name evokes images of ruthless ambition and cold-blooded cunning. Originally destined for the church like his father, Cesare possessed a brilliant, if utterly amoral mind. He was handsome, athletic, and fiercely intelligent, but also prone to explosive rages and acts of shocking brutality. Alexander made him a cardinal at just 18, hoping to secure his place within the church hierarchy. But Cesare chafed under the scarlet robes. He longed for military glory, for the clank of armor and the thrill of battle, not the dusty confines of the Vatican. He was a man of action, and he saw his father's ambitions for the Borgia family not as a burden, but as an opportunity for his own meteoric rise. Lucrezia, his only legitimate daughter with Vannozza, was a woman of legendary beauty and undeniable charm. She was intelligent, cultured, and, by all accounts, possessed a gentle nature. But for Alexander, Lucrezia was a political pawn, a valuable commodity to be traded in the ruthless marriage market of Renaissance Italy. Her fate was inextricably linked to the ever-shifting alliances of the Borgia papacy. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, was dissolved by Alexander himself on the grounds of non-consummation, a blatant lie to free her for a more advantageous union. This annulment, engineered by her father, was a scandal in itself, highlighting the Pope's willingness to bend canon law to suit his family's political needs. Lucrezia, barely out of her teens, was already becoming a symbol of her family's unholy machinations. The first major crisis of Alexander's papacy, one that brought him immense personal grief and revealed the depths of his family's internal darkness, occurred in 1497. Juan, Duke of Gandia, had been seen riding through the streets of Rome with a mysterious companion one evening, only to disappear without a trace. Days later, his body was pulled from the Tiber River, mutilated and weighted down. Rome was aghast. The Pope was heartbroken. For a brief period, Alexander VI seemed to genuinely grieve, retreating into himself, ordering a formal inquiry, and even speaking of genuine reform within the Church. Here was a glimpse of the human father, devastated by the loss of his son. But the grief was short-lived, quickly overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of power. The investigation into Juan's murder quickly stalled, shrouded in whispers and dark rumors. The prime suspect, though never officially charged, was none other than Cesare Borgia. The motive? Juan's incompetence and Cesare's burning ambition. Cesare, it was rumored, could no longer tolerate his feckless brother obstructing the Borgia family's military aspirations, which Cesare felt he alone was capable of fulfilling. Whether Alexander truly believed Cesare was the killer, or simply chose to ignore the possibility for the sake of his dynastic plans, remains one of history's most chilling questions. What is certain is that after Juan's death, Alexander's focus shifted entirely to Cesare, unleashing his son's formidable, ruthless talents upon Italy. Here's where it gets truly dark. With Juan gone, Cesare was free to shed his cardinal's robes, a dramatic and unprecedented move for a high-ranking churchman. Alexander granted his son a special dispensation, allowing him to resign from the cardinalate and pursue a secular career. Cesare, now Duke of Valentinois, became his father's chosen instrument, a veritable whirlwind of military conquest and political intrigue. Alexander poured vast sums of papal money into financing Cesare's armies, equipping him with the finest mercenaries and artillery. Cesare's goal, with his father's explicit blessing, was to carve out a new Borgia dukedom in central Italy, particularly in the Romagna region, consolidating papal power while simultaneously creating a personal kingdom for himself and his family. Cesare's campaigns were brutal and effective. He swept through the Romagna, conquering city after city, often employing terror and ruthless efficiency. Lords who resisted were swiftly crushed, their lands seized, their castles razed. Cesare became known for his cunning, his cruelty, and his unwavering determination. He was Machiavelli's ideal prince, a man who understood that power was maintained through a combination of fear and guile. Alexander VI, from the opulent confines of the Vatican, watched his son's conquests with immense pride, gloating over every victory, seeing in Cesare the realization of his dynastic dreams. Meanwhile, Lucrezia continued to be a pawn in this grand, brutal game. After the annulment of her first marriage, she was married to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscaya and Prince of Salerno, a nephew of the King of Naples. This was a politically strategic alliance, designed to cement the Borgia family's ties with the powerful Kingdom of Naples. For a brief time, Lucrezia seemed to find a measure of happiness, even giving birth to a son. But then, political winds shifted. The alliance with Naples became inconvenient for Alexander and Cesare, who were now seeking new allies, particularly with France. What happened next would haunt Lucrezia forever, and further cement the Borgia reputation for ruthless pragmatism. Alfonso, Lucrezia's husband, was attacked and gravely wounded on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the initial assault, only to be strangled in his bed a few weeks later by Cesare's infamous henchman, Michelotto Corella, under the pretext that he was too slow to recover and was plotting revenge. Lucrezia was devastated. She openly mourned her husband, a stark contrast to her family's cold calculation. The message was clear. Anyone who stood in the way of the Borgia family's ambitions even a beloved son-in-law, would be eliminated without hesitation. After Alfonso's murder, Lucrezia was quickly married off again, this time to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara, a much more prestigious alliance. This marriage was a testament to Alexander's unwavering commitment to his dynastic plans, even at the cost of his daughter's emotional well-being. Lucrezia, by this point, was hardened by her experiences, though she would later find a measure of peace and respectability in Ferrara. The papal court under Alexander VI became a byword for opulence, excess, and open debauchery. The Vatican, the very heart of the Catholic Church, was transformed into a lavish palace worthy of a secular monarch. Alexander poured immense sums of money into renovating the Borgia apartments, commissioning Pinturicchio to create breathtaking frescoes that depicted his family members in various allegorical and religious scenes, blurring the lines between the sacred and the profane. Gold, silk, and precious jewels adorned every surface. Parties were frequent and extravagant, lasting late into the night, fueled by fine wines and exotic foods. Mistresses were not just tolerated, they were openly acknowledged. Alexander himself continued to maintain a relationship with Giulia Farnese, a woman so beautiful she was known as La Bella, even after he became pope. She was married to an Orsini, but openly lived in the Vatican, bore Alexander a daughter, and saw her brother, the future Pope Paul III, rapidly advance through the church hierarchy thanks to her influence. The scandal was immense, but Alexander, steeped in his moral relativism, seemed impervious to criticism. He was pope. He could do as he pleased. The world could condemn him, but he believed his position was unassailable. The climax of this reign of unchecked power and moral decay would arrive, fittingly, in the form of a banquet, a spectacle of such brazen sacrilege that it would forever be etched into the memory of history. It was November 11th, 1501, and the occasion was a celebration, ostensibly to mark the marriage of Lucrezia Borgia's new sister-in-law, Angela Borgia, to a minor nobleman. But the true purpose, as everyone present understood, was far more sinister and far more titillating. This was not merely a party. It was a deliberate, calculated display of power, a performance of absolute authority where the most sacred norms were not just broken, but gleefully trampled underfoot. The setting was the private apartments of Alexander VI in the Apostolic Palace, rooms that should have resonated with quiet prayer and spiritual contemplation. Instead, they throbbed with the pulse of revelry, the air thick with the scent of perfume, sweat, and the rich, heavy aromas of a feast designed to overwhelm the senses. 50 courtesans, the most beautiful and accomplished women from Rome's most infamous houses, had been summoned. They were not there to serve. They were there to perform, to be objects of desire in a game orchestrated by the Pope himself. Their bodies, draped in little more than their own beauty, were laid out on a vast carpet, illuminated by the flickering flames of hundreds of torches and candles, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the saints painted on the walls above. Alexander VI, now an old man, his face perhaps a little more jowly, his eyes still sharp but perhaps a little more jaded, watched from his throne-like chair. Beside him, Cesare, his face a smirk of cold amusement, and Lucrezia, whose expression was now a carefully crafted mask of polite indifference, the years of scandal and manipulation having stripped away her youthful innocence. The guests, a hand-picked collection of cardinals, nobles, and courtiers, many of whom owed their positions to the Borgia family, sat at tables laden with every imaginable delicacy, each dish a testament to the boundless wealth and audacious extravagance of the Borgia pontiff. The air was thick, not just with the scent of spices and roasted meats, but with an almost palpable humidity of anticipation, a nervous energy that vibrated through the very stones of the ancient palace. Servants, moving with a practiced, almost robotic efficiency, circulated among the guests, refilling goblets with the finest Falernian wine, their faces carefully blank, betraying no hint of judgment or surprise at the spectacle they were witnessing. They were accustomed to the Borgia court's excesses, but even for them, this night held a unique, unsettling flavor of the truly forbidden. The Pope, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous, almost impish light, surveyed the scene before him. His heavy gold ring, emblazoned with the papal crest, glinted as he lifted his goblet, taking a long, slow sip. He was no longer the shrewd politician, the calculating administrator. Tonight, he was the grand impresario, the architect of a debauched theatrical performance, the master of ceremonies for a descent into hedonism. He relished the power, the sheer, unassailable authority that allowed him to command such a display, to challenge the very foundations of morality and piety within his own sacred residence. His satisfaction was absolute, a profound sense of self-justification that transcended any earthly critique. He was the Pope, and therefore, what he sanctioned in his own mind could not be truly profane. Cesare, seated to his father's right, leaned back in his chair, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. His gaze was colder, more analytical than his father's, observing the guests as much as the women. He saw their nervous excitement, their barely contained lust, the thinly veiled shame in some, the outright glee in others. For Cesare, this was another demonstration of Borgia dominance, a public assertion that the old rules, the old pieties, simply did not apply to them. It reinforced the message he had so brutally delivered through his military campaigns. The Borgias were above the law, above tradition, above even the church's own moral code. He was his father's son, perhaps even more ruthless, more pragmatic, and certainly less encumbered by the vestiges of a spiritual conscience. He saw the world as a chessboard, and people, even the most powerful, as pawns to be moved, exploited, or discarded. Tonight, these courtesans and these cardinals were simply pieces in a game designed to entertain the ultimate players. Lucrezia, positioned elegantly to Alexander's left, sat with a composure that belied the storm of conflicting emotions churning within her. Her beautiful face, framed by cascades of golden hair, was serene, almost ethereal, but her eyes, though downcast at times, occasionally darted towards the scene on the carpet, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps revulsion, perhaps a weary acceptance, perhaps even a morbid curiosity born of her own tragic experiences. She had long ago learned the art of survival in her family's treacherous court, an art that demanded a meticulous suppression of her true feelings, a careful adherence to the roles her father and brother assigned her. She was the beautiful, malleable pawn, the prize in their political marriages, the silent witness to their unspeakable acts. Tonight, she was simply another prop in the Borgia show, her presence lending a veneer of family unity to the scandalous proceedings. She had seen too much, endured too much, to be truly shocked anymore, but a part of her, the younger, more innocent Lucrezia, surely recoiled from the blatant sacrilege. What must the saints in the frescoes above think? She might have wondered, as their hallowed space was transformed into a den of iniquity. Then came the signal. Not a word, but a knowing glance from Alexander, a subtle nod to his chamberlain. The music, which had been a low, suggestive hum, suddenly swelled, becoming more insistent, more primal. Servants, baskets in hand, began to circulate, not offering food to the guests, but scattering vast quantities of chestnuts across the floor, letting them rain down upon the bodies of the 50 naked courtesans. The nuts bounced and rolled, some lodging in the women's hair, others resting in the hollows of their bodies, a strange, almost absurd sight amidst the raw sensuality. A collective gasp, then a ripple of nervous laughter, swept through the assembled company. The Pope, his voice resonating with a booming theatrical command, finally spoke. "Let the games begin," he declared, his eyes twinkling with unholy delight. "He who gathers the most chestnuts, using only his mouth, shall have his choice of these lovely ladies, to be enjoyed here tonight, without reservation." The command hung in the air, electric with its implications. For a moment, a stunned silence descended, as if the guests were processing the sheer audacity of the demand. These were cardinals, men of God, sworn to celibacy and purity. These were nobles, men of honor, expected to uphold a certain decorum. But the lure of papal favor, the intoxicating thrill of transgression, and the primal urge of lust proved too powerful to resist for many. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, men began to descend from their seats. Some, red-faced and hesitant, lowered themselves to their knees with an air of profound embarrassment. Others, bolder and more practiced in the ways of debauchery, dropped to all fours with a predatory gleam in their eyes. The scene that unfolded next was a grotesque parody of a harvest, a macabre ballet of human degradation. Cardinals, their scarlet robes discarded or awkwardly hitched up, crawled among the writhing forms of the courtesans, their faces contorted in a mixture of effort and lechery, their mouths rooting for chestnuts. The sounds that filled the room were a cacophony of grunts, giggles, the rustle of bodies, and the insistent, driving rhythm of the music. The courtesans, for their part, played their role with practiced skill. Some moaned provocatively, encouraging their pursuers. Others lay still, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, their faces carefully schooled, perhaps lost in a detached resignation. The air grew thick with the cloying scent of bodies, of wine, of the metallic tang of excitement. The flickering torchlight cast distorted shadows, making the scene even more surreal, more hellish. Alexander VI watched, his face alight with an almost childlike glee. He clapped his hands, urged on the participants, his booming laughter echoing through the room. Cesare, still smirking, occasionally pointed out a particularly eager cardinal to his father, sharing a silent, cynical joke. Lucrezia, however, had withdrawn. Her gaze was fixed on a point beyond the spectacle, her expression a fragile mask that seemed to guard a profound internal weariness. She was witnessing not just an orgy, but the continued dismantling of any pretense of sanctity, any last shred of moral authority her family might have claimed. The contest continued for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only an hour, culminating in victorious shouts and the eager pairing off of men and women. The prize, as promised, was claimed there and then, in full view of the assembled company, under the direct gaze of the Pope. The apartment, already a scene of moral chaos, descended into a more visceral, more explicit depravity. The line between observer and participant blurred, as the very act of witnessing became a form of complicity, an endorsement of the Pope's absolute power to define what was permissible. When the last chestnut had been gathered, when the last prize had been claimed, and when the air was thick with the aftermath of indulgence, Alexander VI rose, his face flushed, his eyes still bright. He raised his hand, and the music, finally, faded to a low thrum. "A glorious evening, my friends," he proclaimed, his voice booming with satisfaction. "A night to remember. Let none say that Rome under Alexander VI is a dull city." The guests, exhausted and perhaps a little stunned by their own participation, murmured their agreement, some still breathless, others avoiding eye contact. They had been drawn into the vortex of Borgia power and depravity, and in doing so, had become irrevocably tainted, bound to the Pope by their shared transgression. The Banquet of Chestnuts was not just a wild party. It was a calculated act of subjugation, a test of loyalty, a demonstration of ultimate control. It asserted that Alexander VI was not bound by the rules of men or God, and that those who wished to remain in his favor must be prepared to abandon all scruples. The immediate aftermath of the banquet saw whispers spread like wildfire through the streets of Rome, fueled by the servants who had witnessed the event and the emboldened participants who, in their cups, might have boasted of their exploits. The scandal quickly reached the ears of foreign ambassadors, who dutifully recorded the details in their dispatches back to their respective courts. Europe, already accustomed to tales of Borgia excess, was nonetheless shocked by the sheer brazenness of this particular incident. It was one thing for a pope to have mistresses. It was quite another to orchestrate a public orgy within the Vatican, transforming the apostolic palace into a brothel and its cardinals into groveling participants. Yet, for Alexander VI, the scandal was not a deterrent. If anything, it served to reinforce his image as a man beyond reproach, a figure whose power was so absolute that he could defy all conventions and still retain his throne. He continued to rule with an iron fist, his dynastic ambitions undiminished. Cesare, emboldened by his father's unwavering support, continued his brutal campaigns in the Romagna, consolidating his power and establishing a formidable personal army. Lucrezia, after the murder of Alfonso of Aragon, was married off to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, a crucial alliance that cemented the Borgia family's ties to one of Italy's most prestigious ruling houses. She departed Rome, leaving behind the dark shadow of her family's reign, to find, surprisingly, a measure of peace and a calm reputation for piety and good governance in Ferrara. Her story, a testament to resilience amidst unimaginable pressures, stood in stark contrast to the relentless ambition that defined her father and brother. But the Borgia reign was not without its challenges, its cracks in the facade of invincibility. Across the Alps, the shadow of France loomed large. King Charles VIII and later Louis XII both harbored ambitions in Italy, leading to a series of devastating invasions that plunged the peninsula into prolonged warfare. Alexander VI, ever the pragmatist, masterfully navigated these treacherous international waters, sometimes aligning with France, sometimes against it, always with an eye towards the advancement of his family's interests. He was a master of diplomacy, a cunning manipulator who could shift allegiances with breathtaking speed, leaving his enemies reeling. Perhaps the most potent challenge to Alexander VI's moral authority came not from rival European powers, but from within the Church itself, from the fiery denunciations of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar in Florence. Savonarola was a prophet of doom, a charismatic preacher who railed against the corruption of the Church, the decadence of the Renaissance, and, most pointedly, the moral depravity of Pope Alexander VI. He called for a spiritual cleansing, a return to asceticism, and predicted divine judgment upon a sinful Italy. Savonarola's sermons captivated Florence, leading to the infamous bonfires of the vanities, where citizens cast their worldly possessions, their luxurious clothes, their pagan artworks, and their immoral books into purifying flames. For a brief period, Savonarola held Florence in his thrall, creating a theocratic republic that directly challenged the Pope's authority. Alexander VI, initially dismissive, grew increasingly concerned as Savonarola's influence spread. He excommunicated the friar, denounced him as a heretic, and eventually, through political pressure and the manipulation of Florentine factions, succeeded in bringing about Savonarola's downfall. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, convicted of heresy, and publicly hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. His death was a stark reminder that while Alexander VI reveled in sin, he would tolerate no challenge to his temporal or spiritual power. The demise of Savonarola cemented Alexander's belief that he was divinely protected, that his actions, however worldly, were ultimately beyond judgment. The final years of Alexander VI's pontificate were marked by a frantic, almost desperate push to secure Cesare's burgeoning dukedom in the Romagna. The Pope, now in his early 70s, still possessed an astonishing vitality and an unwavering commitment to his dynastic vision. He continued to raise immense sums of money, often through the blatant sale of cardinalates and other church offices, to fund Cesare's ever-expanding military campaigns. He even went so far as to seize the estates of wealthy cardinals and Roman nobles, often on trumped-up charges, to replenish his coffers. This ruthless expropriation of wealth further solidified his reputation as a tyrannical, avaricious ruler, a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. But time, the ultimate arbiter, was running out. In August of 1503, a virulent fever swept through Rome. Malaria was endemic in the city, and the summer months were often deadly. Alexander VI, despite his robust constitution, fell gravely ill. For several days he struggled, his powerful will fighting against the encroaching weakness. His court was plunged into a state of anxious anticipation. Many saw his illness as divine retribution for his scandalous reign, while others, particularly his loyalists, prayed fervently for his recovery. On August 18, 1503, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, breathed his last. The official cause of death was malaria, but persistent rumors, fueled by the Borgia family's reputation for poisoning, suggested otherwise. Many believed he had accidentally poisoned himself with a drink intended for a wealthy cardinal whose property he coveted, or that Cesare, ever the pragmatist, had finally decided his father had outlived his usefulness. Whatever the true cause, his death sent shockwaves across Europe. The Borgia reign, built on a foundation of ambition, ruthlessness, and scandal, had come to an abrupt, unceremonious end. The immediate aftermath of his death was chaotic. Cesare, also gravely ill with the same fever, was too weak to consolidate his power. The cardinals, many of whom had secretly resented Alexander's tyranny, quickly moved to dismantle the Borgia legacy. The Papal States, which Alexander and Cesare had so painstakingly brought under Borgia control, quickly fragmented. The lands Cesare had conquered were lost, his armies disbanded. Within months, the mighty Borgia dynasty, which had seemed so invincible, collapsed like a house of cards. Cesare, stripped of his power, eventually fled Italy, only to die a few years later in a minor skirmish in Navarre, far from the glory he had so desperately sought. The legacy of Alexander VI, the most perverted pope in history, is a complex and deeply troubling one. He was a man of immense intellect, charm, and administrative talent, a true Renaissance prince who could have been remembered for his patronage of the arts, his diplomatic skill, or his effective governance of the Church's vast temporal domains. But his unbridled ambition, his profound moral relativism, and his obsessive desire to elevate his family above all else ultimately consumed him. He transformed the sacred office of the papacy into a secular instrument of power, blurring the lines between spiritual authority and worldly dominion to an extent that horrified his contemporaries and continues to shock us today. The Banquet of Chestnuts, that infamous night of debauchery in the Vatican, stands as a grotesque symbol of his reign. It was more than just an orgy. It was a defiant declaration that power, when unchecked by conscience or morality, can lead to the most profound forms of human degradation. It stripped away any pretense of spiritual leadership, revealing instead a cynical manipulator who saw the Church not as a divine institution, but as a personal fiefdom to be exploited for his own ends. This tortured history of Alexander VI and the Borgia family forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, power, and the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. It reminds us that even those entrusted with the highest spiritual offices are susceptible to the same flaws and temptations that plague all humanity: greed, lust, ambition, and the desire for absolute control. The story of Alexander VI is a cautionary tale, a stark warning across the centuries that when the pursuit of power eclipses all moral considerations, when the sacred is profaned for personal gain, the consequences are not merely historical footnotes, but profound and lasting scars on the human soul. His reign, culminating in spectacles like the Banquet of Chestnuts, serves as a chilling testament to the enduring capacity of human beings to justify the most egregious acts in the name of their own self-interest, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate with its timeless, unsettling lessons about the true cost of unchecked ambition.